Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Keller College. My name is Juliet Carpenter. I'm the Director of Research here at the Global Centre on Healthcare and Urbanisation. And we run these public seminars twice a term, so welcome to the Week 8 public seminar this term on why adapt our homes to rising temperatures. The public seminars bring together our Global Centre interests in health and sustainable urban development. And we're delighted today to have Jesus Lizana, who is an architect currently based at the School of Engineering Science. And he's put together the programme for today. He'll be chairing it on why adapt our homes to rising temperatures. He's brought together a raft of researchers and practitioners to address this question. So welcome everyone to the seminar, and Jesus, if you'd like to step forward. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, welcome everyone to this new seminar in Keller College. I am Jesus Lizana. I am an architect, Juliet said. I'm a Curie research fellow in the University of Oxford, in this university. I'm also a researcher in the Future of Cooling program of the Oxford Martin School, in which I'm interdisciplinary team. We are working together to shape the future of cooling. Tonight I will be chairing this seminar with 4 fantastic speakers that are coming from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds, who are going to provide answers to the following question: why adapt our homes to rising temperatures? If you remember, last summer we registered for the first time in the UK temperatures higher than 40 degrees Celsius, in something that we never saw before. And this is because the way that we understand climate is changing. It's changing globally, not even in the UK, with heat events and high heat exposure happening more often and longer. So even in the UK, we need to start considering the implications of this high heat exposure. And what kind of solutions can we start implementing in our cities, in the built environment, in order to be more resilient to the heat? So in order to address this issue, tonight we have 4 speakers who are going to introduce what are the implications of this high heat exposure in the UK. What are the challenges that the existing building stock is facing regarding this climate change? What solutions are we implementing right now in new home designs in order to address heating and cooling as a whole in the building design to promote well-being and health? Radhika, André, Patrick, and Charlie, thank you very much for being here today. We are delighted to have you in this seminar. In terms of format, every speaker will have 5 minutes in order to introduce their perspectives into the topic, one after the other, and after all the presentations, I will open up the floor for questions. So, without further delay, I will start introducing our first speaker, who is Professor Radhika Khosla. She is Associate Professor at the School of Geography and Environment in the University of Oxford. She is also Research Director of the Oxford Indoor Center for Sustainable Development. She is also a fantastic principal investigator of the Future Cooling program, where I am working with her. So, Radhika, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jesus. Is this working?
Yes.
All right.
So I have 5 minutes to do this, and it's probably the fastest that I would have gone through some of these slides. So I'll begin right away. So like Jesus said, that we have a program called the Future of Cooling at the Oxford Martin School, and we started this, I want to say, 4 years ago. And I remember when we started out, there was this sort of curiosity in Oxford where folks said cooling. That's really interesting, and for me, what really sort of sparked the light was that some very senior faculty would say, till you said that, it never struck us that cooling could be an issue. And now, 4 years on, we're in a different world where actually the rise of extreme heat is no longer something that is surprising. Last year, for the first time, the UK Met Office issued an extreme heat warning for the UK, and that was. It was a moment which sort of marks this turn towards more frequent, more intense, and longer duration heat waves that are increasing in probability all around the world. Now, the thing that is really sort of chilling in these prospects is that the projection is that an equivalent of 10 new air conditioners will be sold every second for the next 30 years. And that's the magnitude of cooling increase that we're going to see. So that's 10 new ACs every second for the next 30 years. And at the same time, currently 1.1 billion people already have a lack of access to cooling. So they're at risks of really suffering from extreme heat. So by 2050, the cooling that will be required globally is going to be equivalent of that of the USA, Europe, and Japan. And the thing that I find really striking is that in spite of this growth, which is immense, we're going to be in a world by 2050 where 5 to 6 billion people will not have the capacity to adapt to extreme heat because they will not have access to air conditioners for all kinds of reasons. So essentially, we're on a growth of high extreme heat, high air conditioning purchase, and high inequities within the system. And that just seems wrong, right, at so many levels. The good news is that in a way, we're only at the beginning of the curve. This graph, again, I think is so telling because in a place where, it's cold, where we've thought about heating traditionally, not just in the UK, but actually in our energy discourses more broadly as the fundamental problem of thermal comfort. If we look to the end of the century, global energy demand from air conditioning is going to be higher than that from heating. And when I show this in the UK, again, it's a bit surprising because we think that that's where the big guzzler is. But actually, by the end of the century, air conditioning demand is going to be higher than that from heating globally. And the good thing, in some sense, is that we are only at the start of this S-shaped curve. So, while the forecast predicts that we're locking ourselves into a single technology that is very damaging to the environment, we're also in a moment and a place where it is possible to change what we lock ourselves into. And that's what the purpose of our program is, to understand and shape the future of global cooling demand. So just a sort of brief overview of this program that Jesus was talking about. It's based at the Oxford Martin School with researchers from geography, engineering, health sciences, and it's very interdisciplinary. Our goal is to both understand and shape global future cooling demand, and we use different types of analytical tools to be able to do that, whether it's socio-technical analysis, social cultural determinants of thermal comfort, technological assessments, health impacts of extreme heat, circular economy and the global production network, the role of refrigerants and F-gases, and the role of infrastructure, cities, and buildings. We don't have time to go into that, but I'm happy to talk about it later. And what we've been doing is trying to establish cooling as a discipline that sits at the heart of climate and sustainability, influencing the public discourse on heat resilience and cooling, and also feeding into policy, especially around global and national action plans for net zero cooling. Now, I'll talk, I don't even know how much time I have left, but I'm gonna, I have 2 slides. The one thing I'd like to leave you with is that, what we did is we started out by saying, how is cooling linked to the Sustainable Development Goals? And we found evidence that it's linked to each of the different 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But when you go into a search in the literature, and we looked at over 12,000 journals in different disciplines, we found that the words cool, cooling, cold, refrigeration, freeze, they do not feature in any of the Sustainable Development Goals or their 169 targets. So these goals that are sort of, in which all of our sustainability debates have been anchored for so long, have actually just treated cooling as a blind spot. And even in the UK strategy, it's only mentioned once in the net zero plan, and that too in the annex to heating. So it's really sort of, I think what we found was 0.43% of articles that are linked to sustainability say anything related to cooling, but in the SDGs, it doesn't exist at all. And then what I'd like to end with is this framework that we presented at Nature Sustainability article of ours, which basically provides a pathway forward to think about how you treat cooling as a system. So we think of cooling not just as air conditioning, not just as passive cooling where you open the window, but rather as a system on which there are many macro drivers, which are socioeconomic, technological, environmental, and geopolitical. And that system is made up of 4 stages: resources, production and assemblages, activities, and end of life. And the levers for change into that system are 5: social interactions, technological innovation, business models, governance, and very importantly, infrastructure design. And you can look at these different nodes, which are the intersections of the stages of cooling and the levers of change, as points of intervention that can help shift the system. So I've been very brief. I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A and afterwards. But that sort of provides you with how we're thinking about this as a systemic problem that is responding to this urgent global need to shift the system of heat resilience and cooling towards sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radhika. It's a fascinating project and I enjoy a lot. So thank you for being here today. And now I would like to invite to Dr. André Neto-Bradley, who is working as a senior energy advisor in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero in the UK, previously known as BEIS. So please, André, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Get me on. Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much. And picking up from where Radhika left off, I'm going to talk a little bit about, obviously, cooling is a way of dealing with the problem of extreme heat. But when we talk about extreme heat, we spend a lot of time, a lot of our activities during the day in our buildings. And so adapting to extreme heat really requires adapting our buildings to deal with this extreme heat. And so I'm going to talk to you about 3 particular challenges with adapting the building stock we have here in the UK to climate change, and in particular to the risk of extreme heat. But first of all, I'd be remiss of me not to start by pointing as a policy person who works in the policy sphere to point to legislation. And I don't want to drone on about this, but I think there's an important point here about the Climate Change Act. It's one of the pieces of legislation that people might have actually heard of. But crucially, it's the legal basis for our action to tackle climate change in the UK. And I think it's quite important that it's not dealing with climate change and meeting our net zero targets in terms of reducing emissions. They're not optional. It's the law. We have to do it. It's an act of Parliament. And we often focus on this net zero goal, so reducing our emissions to this goal of net zero by 2050. But the Climate Change Act also makes the case that, and actually commits the UK to planning to adapt to the impacts of unmitigatable climate change. And so extreme heat fits within that context of unmitigatable climate change. As Radhika mentioned, the Met Office and the projections, and certainly the Met Office's projections of the likely warming scenarios for 2050 and 2080, they don't look good. If you haven't seen it, they have a fantastic little video on the website, which is the forecast for summer 2050, and it's pretty scary viewing. But that's the context. We need to do something about this, but it's also a legal obligation. It's not an option. The Climate Change Act makes it a legal obligation. But I talked about these 3 challenges, and onto these 3 challenges. So the first of these is really about the building stock, the buildings we have. Now, I quite like this picture because it comes from a collection of photos of, I think, typical homes in London from the late 1890s to the early 1900s. And what I really like about it is that's a photo that's over 100 years old, and yet many of you have either at some point in your life lived in a house that looks just like that, or currently do live in a house that looks just like that. I think that's a really important point, which is that about 30% of our homes are over 100 years old, and about 60% of our homes were built in a time before building standards as we know them. And this is important for an important challenge for 2 reasons. First of all these buildings are old and have plenty of other problems. They may be falling apart, may be suffering from mold damage, so on and so forth. But secondly, they were built in a time when we weren't thinking at all about extreme heat. And so they're really not built for the conditions that are coming. And the UK is particularly bad at this. I've put it in brackets at the top, the world's oldest building stock. Depending who you talk to, you may get some disagreement, but it's certainly we have some of the oldest buildings in Europe, if not the world. The second thing, and the second challenge I want to sort of put to the floor, is this issue that climate hazards, they don't they don't exist in a silo. So we're here talking about extreme heat today, but when we're adapting our housing stock and our buildings for climate change, we don't just need to adapt them to extreme heat, we need to adapt them to other extreme weather conditions, storms, flooding, so on and so forth. And so it's this thinking that we need a slightly more systems approach, slightly more holistic thinking. These problems, we're not going to deal with them in a silo. If we deal with one, we need to deal with all together. And the third and final challenge to sort of put to the floor is this question of adaptation isn't really sexy, it's not very exciting. It is a little bit boring but necessary. And I think when we talk about action on climate change, we talk a lot about sort of meeting our net zero goals and all this innovation we're going to roll out. It's very exciting. We're going to build new wind turbines, new storage solutions, so on and so forth. It's very exciting. It's delivering positive. But adaptation, first of all, often adaptation is about maybe smaller, slightly more boring, or slightly less exciting measures and changes that we can make. But I think an important distinction is that adaptation is really about making, if reducing our emissions is about, guaranteeing or ensuring a future for humanity, adaptation is about making that future more livable. But it does have a bit of an image problem that we're talking about making a bad situation less bad rather than doing something fancy and positive. And I think this is also quite a challenge in getting attention and focus on this issue. So those are my three challenges, and I'm happy to take questions and obviously hopefully a bit of discussion. But thank you very much, and thanks.
Thank you very much, André. It's really interesting to know your perspectives into the UK challenges. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Fahr. He is health economics in the National Department of Primary Health Sciences in the University of Oxford. He also leads the Health World Package in the Future of Cooling program. So, Patrick, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
I am going to talk a little bit about the heat and health nexus. And a good starting point for this is this screenshot from the recent report of the Atlantic Council, in which the impact of an increased number of heat waves around the globe was discussed. And it was mainly discussed in the context of the impact of lost productivity due to extreme heat and heat waves, and how this might affect the prospective GDP growth across the country, mainly in the global south. But it also, for the first time, we discussed in detail how extreme heat is more and more killing individuals. Now, when we look at the UK, what we can see is an increased number of extreme heat days during the last many years, starting in 1976 on the very left, and moving all across to the right towards more recent data provided by the Met Office from the 18th of July in 2022. And one can see, based on this scale, that temperatures in the purple sort of regions have increased up to 38 degrees and have spread across all of England during that time period. If we would have data from last year, where for the first time the 40-degree heat barrier was overstepped, we would actually see more and more of the brown shaded colors all across these, particularly the southeast of England. And this graphic shows you the top 10 hottest UK days on record, where the last 7 of the hottest have been since the year 2000. So quite significant number of extreme heat days happening only in very recent past, just to get an idea how heat has become a very prominent topic in this space, and with heat exposure to human health. Now, in terms of the physiological pathways for human heat strains and the way the human body reacts to extreme heat exposure, and I have to say I'm not a medic, so this is very superficial explanation, is that the body reacts in 2 very specific ways to extreme heat. One is the redistribution of blood flow towards the skin, so giving up heat from the muscles towards the skin. The other option is when you sweat through evaporation, the body gets cooled down. The issue here, however, is that with this increased cardiac demand, the mismatch between high cardiac oxygen demand and compromised cardiac oxygen delivery, there's something like cardiovascular problems that arise that very often lead to either significant morbidity, but very often also to mortality. And colleagues from the London School of Medical Hygiene and Tropical Medicine have just recently published an extremely interesting paper on excess mortality in England and Wales due to extreme heat exposure. And this was a case time series that included over 10 million excess deaths across England and Wales during the time period of 2000 and 2019. And the main conclusion was that the average annual excess mortality that can be attributed to heat is around 800, to be specific 791, whereas attributable to cold is actually above 60,000. And the risks that you can see across the heat maps on the very left, and then you can ignore the middle column, but on the very right, the cold, you can see that there's a significant difference between, well, not age in this case, but across the geographic areas in which especially heat affects negative health outcomes, so in this case mortality. So when we look at the very bottom left side, we see London with most excess mortality due to heat based in the very urban center of the city, whereas when we look at the colder area on the very top bottom right side, most darker shading happens in the sort of more socioeconomically deprived areas in London. And to move on from mortality towards morbidity, to also understand, well, if heat isn't really a big problem compared to cold when it comes to mortality, well, is it maybe a problem to morbidity, and how does it affect NHS demand? And so we in the Department of Primary Care, together as part of the Future of Cooling project, analyzing the relationship between extreme heat exposure and healthcare resource utilization, using administrative care records for close to 7 million individuals across the UK. And our preliminary results have show that whereas when it gets extremely cold, people are actually less likely to go to use primary and secondary care services. When it gets extremely warm on the day of exposure, individuals are actually about 10% more likely to use healthcare resources. And our next final step in this analysis will be to actually translate that into a monetary value to then present to the NHS and to the government and tell them how much more additional excess extreme heat it will actually cost the NHS. And I'm happy to discuss those kind of things and the data that I'm using later if anyone's interested to collaborate, because we have an extremely rich amount of data for analysis ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. It's really amazing the work that you are doing. And now, moving to our last speaker, I am delighted to introduce you to Charlie Luxton, an amazing architect working here close to Oxford, head of Charlie Luxton Design Company, and well known for presenting famous television programs on architecture and home designs, such as Homes by the Sea. Charlie, thank you very much for coming here. We are delighted to have you. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Got an architect, did a master's, now got the badge. So basically, designing new buildings. Clearly, the most important thing is adapting the existing buildings we've got. We shouldn't knock down any buildings. There's too much embodied carbon. But let's say we are going to build some new buildings, and we will continue to build new buildings. We need to start thinking much more dynamically. And I think this is a really useful sort of mind exercise that I use when trying to design a building. Is that a building should be adapted specifically for the location where it is, okay? Buildings are not like any other thing that we make, pretty much, is that they don't move. And everything else moves and changes, buildings don't. So you can optimize for that location absolutely perfectly. Now, traditionally, we've optimized very heavily to reduce energy demand for heating, certainly in the north. And that is now changing, and we need to really start thinking about overheating, because as the morbidity shows, yes, do get more people dying from cold, but people get very uncomfortable in heat. So there's a kind of a challenge there. So the method that we use is we try and think about the same process by which we're trying to keep the building warm and try and keep the building cool. And that is through a fabric-first approach, effectively, to trying to use, not using any kind of machinery, trying not to use any AC, trying to use as little heating as possible. So that is about insulation and, crucially, very high-performance windows and, crucially, design optimization. Now, the way that we tend to do it in our practice, we're not a huge practice, we're only 11 people, we tend to use a thing called the passive house principles, which you might or might know about. Lots of insulation, lots of air tightness, triple glazing, mechanical ventilation, and crucially, this idea of thermal modeling. So you build a very basic model of the building in a complex Excel spreadsheet, and it tells you exactly how much energy you're getting from every window and losing from every window. And it tells you how much heating you're going to need, and crucially, how much overheating you're going to get. Now, we've been modeling more for overheating than heat demand for about 10 years. This is about a 10-year-old model that we did, and that was 8%, but we did some work and dropped that down to about 6%. You can see we're at 12 kilowatts per meter square per annum. So that, like this building, is what you need to get to for passive certification. But we've never done certification. What we've really been doing passive house for the last sort of 8-9 years is to understand overheating critically. So how then, and the problem we've got is that once you want to, and people want to have nice big windows and views because we don't have a huge amount of daylight. And so if you're having large windows, how do you control overheating? So I'm just going to run through some very simple sort of strategies that we're using alongside the modeling to allow us to create situations like this where you have lovely views and connection with outside. Traditionally, passive houses are often very small and square with quite small windows, which is great, and actually probably what we need to be doing given the body energy of glass. But if you are trying to create more glass, what do you do? So one of the things we're looking very much into is solar shading. We live extraordinarily far north really for the temperature of this country, which is really difficult from an architecture perspective because the sun is very high and it's also very low. The very low sun is very hard to control coming into your building. So south facing, like we are here, is actually quite easy to control. It's east facing and west facing that are a real problem. And the second problem we've got is that actually that light in winter is really positive because it can heat a building. You can get about half of the energy you need for heating a building from the sun, even in this country if it's controlled in the right way. So some level of active control is something that we're looking at, which is movable louvers on the outside of the window. If you have louvers and blinds on the inside of the window, the heat is pretty much in the building. It's kind of too late. And the second thing that we look at a lot at is really good cross ventilation. So we allow ventilation across the building to move heat and dumping heat out of the building. I'm actually showing a picture of a roof light there. We try and avoid roof lights now. We're getting shouted at and putting roof lights in by our energy consultants because they're very hard to control from heat. And there's some very clever, wonderful blinds you can get which sort of reflect the light in, so you still get lighting, so you're not having to turn the lights on even though you've got blinds down. And crucially, control is the other thing that we're really learning about, is that if you can control these things like louvers and blinds and roof lights using some simple monitoring, building control management system, you can reduce the need for artificial cooling. So if you can make your building respond to temperature gain, you can get rid of high energy intensive machinery. Now, yes, there's a bit of energy in putting these in, but they use very little energy once they're installed. So this is a project that we did with large drop-in windows to stop overheating, and you can see that they're controlled by the sun. As the sun moves around, they lift and move off the building and they disappear up into the roof. So this is the kind of approach we've taken in a number of buildings to allow kind of large windows. Now you could argue that's probably not the approach we should be taking, and that is being examined as we move forward because of the challenges around these issues. The other ways we've been looking at, this is a large building that we designed, and it's about future-proofing. So in this building we had a lot, you can see these are double glazed windows on the outside. This is a solar space, sun space, so we're allowing the heat in, and then in summer you open the outer doors and you shut the inner doors, and in winter you open the inner doors and you shut the outer doors. So yes, you have to go and actively do that, but that seems to be fine. But crucially, we've allowed a pergola, and actually we designed the building with louvers to go in over the top. When the client built them, they didn't put them in. They're going in next year because it's now getting warm. But we knew that, and that seems to be happening a lot in our buildings, is those so designed for 5 or 10 years. And this is something we do a lot on the far right-hand side. They are louvers that can be opened on the inside, so it's completely secure cross-ventilation. Really important that you can cross-ventilate a building securely so you can lose heat overnight. So really simple mechanisms that are not air conditioning. I'm not showing air conditioning on purpose. I'm trying to show the things we do. And the principal one is that thermal modelling. And the final one is just simple solar shading. In this case, it's second-hand walkway grids from a factory kind of thing. But, and again, we put those in, and we know they don't quite give enough shading, but we're going to go back and we're going to interweave bits of metal, second-hand bits of metal, where we need it. So I think understanding that your building is adaptable over time is really important, because the temperature is changing massively over time. And this is another building that we're doing. This is the affordable passive house scheme in Hook Norton, where the solar shading has also become balconies because we need outdoor space. So again, how can you use these things that are quite expensive to give you another benefit? So getting one object to do two functions makes me very happy, and normally makes the quantity surveyors very happy and the client very happy. So thinking sort of laterally is really important. So this is actually the PHPP on that building. So you saw the last one was about 8%, we dropped it to about 6%. This one, 0% overheating over 25 degrees. And that is absolutely crucial. So we have been ratcheting down the overheating that we're allowing. So this modelling shows you that at no point should this building get over 25 degrees at any point in the year. And the reason that's really important, because if you run a 2.4 degree temperature rise, that goes to about 12%. So if you look at 2050, that's going to be 12%. So you imagine what the buildings that are getting 10% already are going to be. They're going to get very hot, and we're going to start doing lots of air conditioning and lots of very energy intensive things. No one's really been looking at this. We've been quite unusual, and actually what's bizarre is all the thermal energy modelling stuff you can get with the general software doesn't do overheating. They've been doing energy for years, but no overheating, partly why we've used PHPP. This came in 2022, in June. The government have finally legislated for overheating. It's a whole new part of the building regulation, and it's got two very different methods. The simplified method, which is incredibly prescriptive. You're allowed about 18% of floor area of glass. This room is probably 35%, so this would fail the standard method. You'd need to do very complex analysis on it. And crucially, the new modelling is quite interesting. It's things like you're not allowed any trees at all as part of your shading. So I know a guy who's designing a house in the middle of woodland, and it has to have tiny windows. He was doing the simplified method, even though it's in the middle of a wood. But I can understand it's difficult to try and come for anything. So some very, very final thoughts, and try to cover far too much in a short time. I hope somebody's kept it up somewhere. With a badge if you did. But crucially, I think the really important thing about overheating is to understand that energy gain, like heating and cooling, are two sides of the same coin, and they must be considered in the same way. So the fact that they've pulled overheating into its own specific part of building regs is a bit weird. Internal gains are often underestimated. The amount of heat that the buildings give off internally, so that's a big problem. The amount of gadgets that we're putting in our houses is heating them up from the inside, and heat gain through structure is massively underestimated. I'm glad you showed the white paint going on the roof. We've done buildings where the modelling shows they weren't overheating, and they've got a bit hot because they've underestimated the gain through roofs, and we've had to go back and do more work on them. And crucially is occupier behaviour. It's all well and good to start a low energy building, but if someone doesn't open the windows at night and properly air it out and respond to the temperature, like opening those doors in that glazed area and shutting them, it'll just be too hot. And finally is this going back to this point of stress testing. We need to design our buildings for 2050 and 2080 with those horrifying temperature gradients, because that's what they're going to be standing, hopefully, for 100 years. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Really, really exciting projects and very nice projects. And just now I would like to open up the floor for questions. So please, if you have any question for any of the speakers, or a question that you would like to address by all the speakers, please go ahead. Yes. There, yes.
Hi, firstly, my name is Carl Pitkovsky. I work for the UK Health Security Agency. I'm a consultant in public health, and my team deals with heat wave plans and cold weather plans. And I'd like to thank all four speakers for a fantastic set of talks. I guess, just to say very briefly, about 8 years ago, I was speaking to a major housing developer in the Midlands, and I said, so what are you doing about, do you believe in climate change? And he said, yes, we do. I said, what are you doing about it in designing for your future homes? And he said, nothing. And I said, why not? And he said, because it costs too much and there's not a level playing field for us to do that. And so I guess the question that I've got is, how do we get a level playing field to make it so developers will do this? And particularly for existing homes, the planning side is easy in a sense. it's existing homes, as you've begun to say. Any thoughts around that? Thanks.
Anyone would like to take over?
No, it's a great question, a great point to raise, right? Because I think the issue of cost, you know, for a lot of people, it does come down to money and how much it costs to do this. And, you know, I think, you know, the example of the picture I showed of painting roofs white, sort of using low, you know, high reflectivity paint. That's a cheap and easy measure to do. And there are a lot of cheap and easy measures to use when adapting existing buildings, but the timing is crucial, right? And it's about when you're doing it, right? If you have foresight and you plan ahead and you identify sort of those the low-hanging fruit and the opportunities to put in cheap, cost-effective adaptation measures, it can be done quite cost-effectively, right? But if it's last-minute firefighting and it's 2045 and July 2045 and you're panicking and going around trying to bolt on shading and all of that as fast as we can, it's obviously, you know, it's going to end up costing a lot more than it should. So I think we need to, it's exactly as everybody up here has said, we need to be thinking ahead, and as you yourself said, we need to be thinking ahead, and we need to be designing the buildings for the 2050 and 2080 scenarios, and thinking about that, you know, the journey from here to 2050, 2080, 2100, and the summers we'll have then, and actually where are the opportunities on the way to, for example, if we're retrofitting a building, you know, there's the government has retrofit schemes for installing insulation and whatnot, you know, maybe those could be a vehicle as well for, you know, supporting installation, more shading, maybe, you know, painting roofs white and things like that. So I think it's important to have that long-term view and to identify when are the sort of low-hanging fruit opportunities, because yeah, otherwise it can be really expensive if it's not done in a planned manner, and if we leave it till the last minute, it definitely is going to be expensive, and more people are definitely going to die as a result of it. So I think it's, you know, planning and thinking long-term ahead is really important. But
I'm going to try not to get political here. If we had a government that actually took the issue seriously, I think we'd find a very different situation. And so basically, everyone seems to think, and it's quite funny, the government seems to think that they're not controlling what developers do. It's laughable, really. They're saying, oh, the developers will build what they want. It's like, no, wait a second. They can't build anything unless the state, by the largesse of us, you get a planning permission. You can build some houses. Unfortunately, the developers are very large contributors to the political parties. And so, unfortunately, they have not made the difficult decisions that they need to when we build housing. Now, what makes me think that even more than I did before, because if you made it more difficult and building regulations were serious and enforced, the price of land would go down. Right? And let's just be honest, at the moment, land is too expensive, and therefore, for what houses can be afforded, even at the ludicrous prices that they are, and therefore they don't have the money in the system to make them more sustainable. So if the building regs are better, they build better houses. Simple as that. And if the building regs are better, the land price would go down. And we know that because we're seeing at the moment in commercial property the new EPC rating. So you can't rent a building, I think it's within the EPC D from now. It's an EPC C from 27 and B from 20, and you should see what it's done to the price of commercial property. It has gone down 20%. There's lots of other things going on, I accept, but it is a massive part of what's driving it down. And people are going, oh my God, we can't carry on with business as usual. We need to make these buildings sustainable. Exactly the same thing could happen to developers if they took they jumped at it properly. Now, what they've done, actually, fair play to them, they've started to get some teeth with the new building regulations of Part O and can't remember which other parts around energy use and insulation. Unless you've made a meaningful start by last June, this June, wasn't it? You had to register, and that means not just what they used to do is make one building on a site and then leave the other 100 buildings for whenever they wanted to build and be locked into that building reg situation. So now a meaningful start means significant start on most of the houses. So we are starting to see the building regulations regime understand that it has a role in solving this problem, and I think they've been incredibly timid up to now, and hopefully being in charge here we will see a different approach.
Off the back of that, I guess I have a thought to add as well, which is, I'm going to be careful what I say, but I think, you know, the focus when we talk, you know, and when talking about building regs, you are talking about new buildings. But I think there's a figure that about 80% of our buildings that we'll have in 2050 already exist today. So what we do about the existing buildings is really important. So for example, you mentioned the EPC requirements for commercial properties. That's actually that's having a huge effect. And actually, a really interesting anecdote from an EPC rater that I spoke to recently, who said that actually, 10 years ago, his clients would come to him and they wanted the EPC for their building, the energy performance certificate, the assessment for it. They wanted it done as cheaply as possible. They didn't care what was in it, just get it done as cheaply as possible. Now, these clients are coming back because it's hit them where it hurts, right? In their pockets, right? So if they don't get the building to meet D or C by whatever year it is, they can't rent out the building anymore. So they come back to the rater and they actually want to know, okay, my building got an F. Why did it get an F? What was it? Where did it score poorly? What kind of things can I do to improve the rating the most? And so I think, tackling the existing buildings, it has to be done in a way that actually forces people to make a change. And so, the minimum energy efficiency standards, D for now, C in a few years. This actually makes this will make people move. But we need to focus on the existing buildings because most of the buildings we will have in 2050 and even 2080 already exist. So we can't build them from scratch anymore. We've got to find a way to adapt them. But I've said plenty.
Hi, Sue Roth, Emeritus Professor of Architectural Engineering at Heriot-Watt. About regulations, if you take the gloves off, the building regulations are written by HVAC engineers who are paid according to how much equipment they put in a building. That's the simple truth. Margaret Thatcher sold off the Building Research Establishment in the mid-90s, so we no longer have good independent research. We have an extensive consultancy. And you notice that the overheating and the deaths from overheating and so on, there's more in winter. It's because actually the older buildings are better designed often for the heat than the modern ones. It's the modern buildings that are overheating, and a lot of them, move to passive house design, larger glass walls, heat recirculation, more insulation. It's driving overheating quite a lot. But the question I wanted to ask Charlie is that we are only one superstorm away from the catastrophic failure of grids and really large-scale health and mortality impacts when grids go down. Do you consider now that you should be designing buildings that will keep occupants safe when the grids go down?
I think we are moving away from any kind of technology, trying to reduce the amount of technology in the buildings to make them robust and simple, partly because of the embodied energy work about all of technology. And, for example, on that housing scheme, we've gone from 6 air source heat pumps down to 2. And even then, when you look at the body carbon, it's still a massive chunk. So we are trying to reduce the technology that we're relying on. I think it's very difficult to design for a complete failure, breakdown of civilization, because I suspect at that point your house being a bit hot is really the last of your concerns. There's other things going on, but I take the point that we need to design really robust architecture that doesn't rely. And I think the big thing that's also coming through is just the embodied energy in glass is so high that we need to be reducing the amount of glazing that we're putting in from stock. But again, still, it comes back to that tree analogy that you still then need to be massively shaping the building to ensure you get good daylight levels and all of those kind of things. So, I think we are shifting our thinking. And the problem when you show architecture that you've done, you're looking at 10 years' work and your thinking's moved on very quickly, and what we're thinking now won't come out for another years. But no, I think you're right. It's a reasonable point. We can't rely too heavily on technology because it breaks.
Hello, thank you to all the speakers. I just had a question about wondering if maybe the UK is leading the pack, maybe not, but just globally, if there are any countries that are leading the pack as far as policy and thinking about policy around these issues.
Just briefly, I'm sure Radhika will have something more eloquent and informed than I have to say on this, but I think briefly, we certainly, talk a lot to international partners and sort of keep in touch about different research things through our various collaborations. I think one thing we see is, I don't think on adaptation to extreme heat, or just to climate change in general, the adaptation question, the UK is not leading the pack outright, but we're also not massively behind. Let's say we're sort of somewhere in the middle. I think some countries, by necessity, are having to deal with things much so we think about, for example, examples like Australia, where they've had to deal with some really extreme conditions and enforce a bit of a rethink. The US has been good in some aspects at dealing with some of the impacts of climate change, and things like wildfires come into that as well, and actually management plans. On a policy front, I think an example, getting slightly academic here, but a really interesting example is that of New Zealand, and perhaps they are quite a small country, and I don't know the details of how their political system works, but they have managed to enact a lot of legislation, put in place programs and sort of action on the adaptation front quite quickly, but that might be specific to how New Zealand politics work. I don't know if anybody knows more about New Zealand politics in the room, feel free to correct me. But so there are some examples of where it's sort of moving a little bit faster, partly driven by necessity. The UK is kind of in the middle of the pack, maybe a little bit towards the front in terms of thinking about things, but not so much on acting. But yeah, I'm sure Radhika has more to say than I do.
Not so different, but if you look back at the history of building energy codes, a few decades now, it is a story of failure for the most part, because we've known about buildings and their capacity to be able to mitigate and help us adapt to climate change. I want to say IPCC sort of 2005. It's been at least, if not before. And the community that's worked on this has known this for a long time before that. And yet, it is just one of those sectors that has now become a hard to abate sector. And it's bizarre because we know everything that needs to happen. We know how to do it. But we prefer to think about speculative negative emission technologies as a way to, sort of achieve net zero goals, as opposed to actually working on the built environment and fixing this issue. And I recognize that it's not straightforward, right? It's sort of an entrenched system with immense socio-technical components, with politics, behaviors, people. It's not an easy thing to fix. But we've known that for decades, and you look across countries, and to me, there isn't any place that actually stands out as a leader. If we did some work where we compared net zero buildings and buildings that were, actually operating at either were completely off the grid or very low, had very low energy consumption, and we found most of them in Europe, and this was sort of looking at Passive House and beyond. Part of the problem is it's very hard to get data from other places. We practically found nothing in any of the African countries, and we were looking at peer-reviewed literature for the most part. But it is an unfortunate story of sort of these codes that have existed for a long time, but their actual implementation and their outcomes on the ground have been very poor.
There is a couple of there's some really interesting stuff around it. So the Germans, from what I understand, and I might be quite wrong on these figures, I thought they were spending about 8 billion a year on their pre-1990 building stock and have done for about the last 10 years. So they have a systemic approach to tackling their existing building stock. Now that's more about, traditionally that's been more about heat, but equally what you find is that if you do it well, a building that you deal with for heat will also not get as hot in the summer. So for example, and where we've spectacularly failed, you talked about installation programs. So the installation program that was in place until 2013, when the green crack was got rid of by Cameron, I think it was costing about 2.5 billion a year. No, it would have cost 2.5 billion keeping it running from 2013 until now. And they estimated last year it would save about 3 billion in 1 year of heat and bills alone. So it's that kind of long-term, dynamic, laser-focused thinking that is helping us solve this problem. And I think until we get a serious plan and commit to it and stop changing it every few years, no one is going to have a kind of policy. So I suspect what it is the failure of democracy and the sort of 4-year, 5-year political cycle. So I think that's probably why you don't see any single person with a great result to it. So that's a bit depressing, I'm sorry to say, but you know. So the Germans are doing some interesting stuff, but then they shut down all their nuclear power stations and burn loads of coal. So I mean, they're kind of out of it as well, you know.
Actually, on the note of the German example, quickly, it's very interesting. I think in Germany, when you renovate a building, you don't have to if you build an extension or whatever, you don't necessarily have to make the whole house more efficient. But in Germany, it's very interesting. And I think that's why you have this big investment. When you renovate your building, if you want to put an extension or an extra floor, you know, what a conservatory or whatever, you have to make the rest of the building bring it up to standard. So it makes people think twice about putting a conservatory out back, but also it's actually proven a really effective way of just sort of slowly but surely getting everybody to bring their homes more up to standard. So it's an interesting way of doing things.
Hi everyone, my name is Nina. I'm a practicing architect and senior lecturer at Oxford Brookes University School of Architecture. I specialise in nature-based solutions, so I'd really like to hear about your thoughts on that in relation to cooling and the heat problem, because we all know, you know, if you go to deep into a forest during a heat wave, you feel much more comfortable than, of course, in a building or an office building without air conditioning, or a home working from home sweating in my loft so during a heat wave. So what are your thoughts on nature-based solutions? And I'm just outraged by with regards to foliage and not counting trees. I mean, that's just completely absurd. Blaming the HVAC people probably, you know, it's absolutely crazy. What are your thoughts?
We use them, and actually, I think, I mean, the problem is they're great until you get a massive drought, and then you don't get the transmitted cooling. But, you know, fundamentally, we know the role that trees can play in urban heat, you know, reducing urban heat island effects is massive, it's significant. Not only reducing this sort of heat island and urban heat build-up, but also particulates. So we know that they're really, really powerful. And actually, I mean, I haven't got any sort of data on this, but we have an intensive green roof at home, and in the last heat wave, with those louvers, we got to 26 degrees when it was 40 degrees outside at the maximum. Now, we were using about half a cubic metre of irrigation every 3 days, I think, onto the roof. So you could argue that that's enough, you know, unsustainable use of water resources, but it did seem to have a huge impact on reducing the heat gain from the roof of the building, even if, you know, okay, you go to a white roof, but that has an aesthetic issue when you're in a conservation area. So I think that it has a huge role, certainly for shading, for seasonal shading, and the idea that you completely remove it from any of your dynamic modelling does seem crazy, but the Part O regulations is based off something called TM59, which is a dynamic modelling assessment you do. If you can't make the basic model work, you go to a dynamic modelling system, and TM59 is based from flats in urban areas. So they're taking an urban area flat design system and applying it to all housing to try and work out a dynamic overheating situation, which seems, I don't know, it seems limited in ambition, but maybe I'm being unfair. Now, I do understand that trees can get cut down, but when you design, because things like, if you design a building and you put a landscape plan in, there's a condition that if the plant dies, you have to replace the same plant for 5 years. Now, we all know, a gardener, you never put the same plant somewhere where plants die, but anyway, that's a different thing. So why can't they do the same sort of situation that you need these trees or something similar in these locations? And I think we are, you know, we'd rather just rely on some technology with some flashing lights than something that grows. And I think there is a genuine issue with the way that we do that, because it's very hard to understand how much cooling you're really getting from a tree as it grows, and it's quite dynamic. So it's quite interesting. I was talking to the guys at Yo Valley about regenerative farming in their milk and understanding the carbon in their milk. And they think it's carbon positive because of the amount of carbon they're sucking into the soil. But none of the modelling can deal with open sort of dynamic vegetative systems. It's just not how we build our computer models. So I think that same blind spot where this technology is being developed is meaning that we are not responding and using growing solutions. So, I think that's more of a complaint than an answer. But
It's a blue-green infrastructure thing, isn't it, with water and plants, and it's just madness, absolutely.
yeah,
We're in a climate and biodiversity crisis, so they can help each other in the way we're addressing cooling, and it's a no-brainer, nature-based solutions.
yeah. Just sorry.
Yeah, no. Yeah, just very briefly on that, I think going back to one of my challenges is that I pointed out about like the fact that you're not dealing with any of these climate change issues in a silo, right? And so, I think part of the problem is that we deal on it, when we're dealing with energy in buildings and even talking about cooling and extreme heat in buildings, we're going building by building, aren't we? But there is something to be said for thinking slightly broader, having a bit more of a whole system, whole city approach, and actually, I think some of those nature-based solutions do offer a plausible route for adaptation as part of a suite of other measures, right? But I think exactly as Charlie pointed out, all our standards for calculating things, and it's not those kind of approaches. We don't have a good off-the-shelf model or off-the-shelf certified approach for designing those solutions. And if there isn't one, it's very easy for people to say, "Oh well, it's too difficult. We're not going to do that."
Sounds like a good research project. Get some AI people involved.
It does sound like a good research project. I'll bear that in mind.
I have one question, if I may, one question for Patrick regarding, we saw in your presentation the consequences of the higher number of heat waves, how they are affecting the mobility and mortality. What kind of actions can we take at city level in order to try to avoid the impact of that? Okay. Any thoughts?
When it comes to actions, probably the architects have the answer. But one of the things I heard was the word cost-effective solutions. And so when you think about pharmaceutical industry, like the way we try to prevent people from dying, the government is willing to pay approximately £30,000 per safe quality just life year. And if you look at the potential of people dying early because of extreme heat exposure in their houses, and if you translate that loss of life into a monetary value, you sort of can approximate how much money the NHS or the government should be willing to spend on preventative measures to retrofit houses and so forth. Because, sometimes there are £200,000 spent on extending a person's life for another 2 months, 3 months, in the space of cancer, for example. And so, you can probably find a very cost-effective solution where the effectiveness is estimated through the outcome measure of what kind of quality-adjusted life years or disability-adjusted life years you would prevent. So, we're trying to work out how we could to sort of translate that technology these masks that are used in technology assessment to looking at sort of sustainable preventive climate change technology assessment. And nothing really has been done in this space so far. So
it's kind of interesting because I remember seeing a really interesting talk up at the Passive House Trust up in Brooks about the economic impact of poor quality housing on the Welsh economy. And they reckoned it cost over £1 billion a year, poor quality housing, because you've got health issues, loads of health issues and down to poor quality housing. You've got people not going to work, you've got people being on benefits, and you've got people relying on the NHS. So in a country with the NHS and a social welfare system, it's bonkers that we don't have better quality housing. It's just literally, it's madness. And actually part of the problem is that we just defrayed costs we're not interested in. Do you know what I mean? So we're not adding up, exactly as you say, we're not adding up the dots of like, well, it's going to cost us this much for people getting really ill from cold. It's going to cost. We need to start looking at these in the round and bringing them all together and understanding these non-siloed way of thinking. And then I suspect we'll finally start acting. But until we do that, I think we'll just, it's not my problem. I'm just looking at this issue. But it's really nuts when you look at the impact of poor quality housing and the likely cost of rectifying it. It all suddenly looks very different economically. It's almost like you can't afford not to do it. But you need a politician to look beyond the 5-year election cycle, put a 10 or 15 years plan in place that doesn't get changed to really get those benefits. Yeah. So it all starts and ends in politics, I think, unfortunately.
Radhika and I and the future cooling people were actually in the process of developing a research project where we develop a vulnerability index related to the built environment. And that's likely, will likely be together with the government of Wales.
We don't have more time. We are at the end of the time frame that we have for the seminar. I only would like to conclude, please, with a big thanks to all most